Good afternoon. Today I'm going to be discussing my February 2022 State of the Collection. I currently have a 3-piece collection and I keep my 3 pieces in this WR4K genuine leather watch travel roll. These watch travel rolls are available on eBay for £70 including worldwide shipping with tracking number. So I'll show you the 3 pieces. On the left we have my Rolex Submariner 124060. In the centre we have my WR4K Ironwatch RX8004, and on the right we have my Seiko 5 SRPE 63K1. So firstly I'll show you the king piece of my collection, which is my Submariner. Now 23 years ago I purchased my first Rolex, which was a Submariner 14060M. And one thing I really liked about the 14060M, and I also like it about this 124060, is it has the perfect symmetry of the Submariner dial layout. The original 1953 Submariner, the 6204 and 6205 respectively, predated the use of a date complication, so therefore they didn't have a Cyclops magnifier and they didn't have a date window. And I really like this symmetry. I like the original dial layout of the first Submariner from 1953, and this is the pure true descendant of that, the 124060, and I really like the lack of the Cyclops magnifier and the perfect symmetry of the maxi dial. So I previously owned the predecessor to this, which is the 11460, and one thing I disliked about that piece was it had the super case with thick square lugs and a 20mm lug width. I always felt that the super case with the 20mm lug width meant that it was top heavy. It felt like a block or like a slab of 9040 oyster steel. This piece at 41mm with a 21mm lug width is better balanced. I think the 21mm oyster bracelet better balances the slimmer lugs on the 41mm head of the piece. So it's a more comfortable, better balanced piece than its predecessor, the 11460. And I prefer the chronology movements, the caliber 3230, which has a superior 70-hour power reserve, versus its predecessor, the caliber 3130, which only had a 48-hour power reserve. So it's technically a better piece, and it's also a better balanced piece, as well as being more aesthetically pleasing. And I like it also, it reminds me of my first Submariner, the 14060M, because it has the similar dial. So with regards to the piece, I recently travelled 108 miles to my nearest Rolex authorised dealer, and the purpose of that visit was to have an extra link put into the Oyster bracelet. As you'll know from my previous reviews, I previously owned an Oyster Perpetual 41 and have a large 8-inch wrist, so I purchased 2 additional links from my Rolex authorised dealer, and I fitted the links to the Oyster Perpetual 41 myself because I like to wear my bracelets loose so that I can always fit an index finger underneath the bracelet and clasp. However, unfortunately, my Rolex authorised dealer has recently changed their policy and they no longer post links out to collectors. One has to visit the authorised dealer and present the piece in person, and then they verify the piece is correct by checking the serial number and inspecting the watch. So I did that. I travelled to the authorised dealer, they verified the piece is correct, and then they fitted the Oyster link themselves. So I can now use the glide lock as it's intended, because previously I could only use the glide lock when it was on maximum extension, and therefore that negated the glide lock mechanism. I wasn't able to adjust it as its intended purpose. But now with the extra link in the Oyster bracelet, I can move the glide lock up and down to get the perfect fit. So I'll explain why the index finger underneath the bracelet and clasp is the correct sizing method. This allows for wrist expansion in warm weather or when one is active. It's often a problem with vintage Rolex pieces that there is stretch in the Oyster and Jubilee bracelets, and often the reason for the stretch is caused by collectors sizing the Oyster and Jubilee bracelets too tight on their wrist. And what that does is that expedites the wear in the screw pins and also the links themselves, and then during a period of wear over a lifetime of a piece, the bracelet then stretches. The screw pins become a sloppy fit in the holes which wear in the links, and therefore one gets slack in the bracelet. So the correct sizing method is to be able to slide an index finger underneath the bracelet and clasp. That takes the shear load off the screw pins and also the bracelet links, and therefore one doesn't get the problem of expedited wear. As you can see, there's plenty of room for the wrist to expand, and therefore the screw pins are never put into shear and they don't expedite the wear. So that's the correct sizing method, and it was actually taught to me early on in my collecting by a very seasoned Rolex collector. He explained to me that one should never size Oyster and Jubilee bracelets too tight on the wrist. An index finger underneath the bracelet and clasp is the correct sizing method, and the piece should be able to float on the wrist bone. It shouldn't be tight, it should be able to slide up and down the wrist bone for comfort. And so I've always sized my bracelets to that method, the index finger underneath the bracelet and clasp, and therefore my bracelets have never had a problem with expedited wear. They've always remained tight. So it's very comfortable. Now I've got the extra link in the glide lock mechanism. Absolutely love this piece. Of all the Rolex watches I've owned over the last 23 years, I've owned several Submariners and Submariner dates. This is my personal favourite. This is the greatest Rolex piece I've ever owned, and I absolutely love it. The feel-good factor is outstanding, the comfort level is outstanding, and it's one of the greatest Rolex watches ever made. And as I've discussed, I regard it as the true descendants of the 6204 and 6205, the first Rolex Submariners from 1953. And really, the true Submariner doesn't have a date complication, and I really like that aspect of it, the symmetry. So next we're going to look at this piece, which arrived yesterday from Ironwatch, and I have to say I'm absolutely delighted with it. This is the WR4K Ironwatch RX8004. It will be available on Ironwatch official store on AliExpress shortly. This is the PT5000 version. I understand they're considering offering it with PT5000 or alternatively the SW200-1. I think the PT5000 is good enough for it, and I absolutely love the piece. I've previously reviewed the RX8004 on my channel, and I declared it a champagne watch for lemonade money. It's one of the favourite pieces I have reviewed. Excellent quality, excellent value, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to reviewing this version, the WR4K version. So what are the differences? Well, this doesn't have applied indices. It's got printed indices, which are BGW9 Super Lume Nova, and it also has mil-sub sword hands, which are like the Rolex 5517 mil-sub. As you know, I have a personal interest in that piece. So absolutely gorgeous piece. I'll give you a wrist shot and you can see how it fits on my 8-inch wrist. So it feels quite similar, although it's 39mm, it wears like a 40 because of the bezel overhang. It wears very similar to my Rolex Submariner, which is a 41mm. Beautiful taper on the lugs, 20mm lug width, balances the 39mm head of the piece very well. The printed dial versus applied indices gives it a more vintage aesthetic, which works very well with the double dome sapphire crystal. And the mil-sub hands make a refreshing change from the Mercedes hands, which are the default option for homages of the Submariner and Submariner dates. So absolutely love the feeling of it. The feel-good factor is outstanding, comfort level is outstanding, gorgeous looking piece, and of course I love the WR4K brand logo on it because that's my channel logo. So just a very good looking piece, and I'm thoroughly enjoying wearing it. Very comfortable, and it's surprisingly low profile. Even though it's got a double dome sapphire crystal, it feels very low profile and flat on wrist. So I'm very happy to have it in my collection, and I enjoy wearing it as much as my Submariner. It's a very well made piece. Now, one thing I want to do while I have it in hand is I'm going to do a lume test, and I'm going to compare it side by side with my Submariner, which uses chromolite, which is the very best of Swiss Super Lume Nova. So I'm just going to put them side by side, and then I'll charge them both up, as always, using my 100 UV LED torch to the absolute maximum, and then we can compare the performance of the RX8004's BGW9 with my chromolite or my Submariner. Right, so the Submariner is now fully charged. I'm just going to charge up the WR4K Ironwatch. Right, so they're both now fully charged, and as you can see, both very similar. The blue tone of the BGW9 Super Lume Nova on the right, on the Ironwatch, is very similar to the blue tone of the chromolites used on my Submariner. Now, in terms of performance, I would actually argue that the mil-sub sword hands used on my Ironwatch actually perform better. They give better legibility in the dark. As you can see, one can easily read the mil-sub sword hands versus the Mercedes hands on my Submariner on the left. Now, in terms of the maxi dial on my Submariner, it really is very close to the printed indices on the Ironwatch on the right. And often it's a thing that collectors think that, well, applied indices allow for more layers of BGW9 Super Luminova to be applied than printed indices, and that's usually the case because the applied indices have more depth, and therefore 5 to 6 layers of BGW9 can be applied to the dial. With printed dials, it's more difficult to apply 5 to 6 layers because the indices are painted on, they're printed rather than being infilled into three-dimensional applied indices. But as you can see, the performance of the dial on the right on the Ironwatch is very similar to the performance of the Maxi dial, which has applied white gold indices on my Submariner. And they're both continuing to glow very brightly for a good length of time. So really, I would argue there is no difference, no discernible difference between the quality of the BGW9 Super Luminova that Ironwatch are using on the RX8004 and my Rolex Submariner, which uses chrome lights. They're still continuing to glow very brightly, and they will continue to glow for a good length of time. And looking at the lume pips on the ceramic bezel inserts, again, there is no discernible difference between the Submariner and the Ironwatch RX8004. If you look at the lume pips at 12 o'clock, they both look very similar size, both glowing brightly, and the performance is equal. So this is something to consider about the quality of the BGW9 Super Luminova used on the Ironwatch. Really, I don't think there's any difference whatsoever between Rolex Chromalights and the BGW9 Super Luminova that Ironwatch are using. It is top grade Super Luminova. So I just thought I would show you a lume test comparison between the two, because it is very similar. I was very impressed when I did it today to test it out myself. I just wanted to see how it looked when it was charged to its absolute maximum. The mil-sub salt hands in particular are outstanding performance, and I actually prefer them to the white gold Mercedes hands used on my Submariner. I think Rolex should have used mil-sub hands rather than using Mercedes hands on the Submariner. They're more aesthetically pleasing, and the truth is, they perform better. So that's my WR4K Ironwatch RX8004, and I'm looking forward to it being released on the Ironwatch official store shortly. And I'm also going to do the same thing, just out of interest. I'm going to compare it with my Seiko 5, which uses Lume Bright, and Lume Bright is one of the best quality looms. I regard it as equal quality to the very best of Swiss BGW9 and C3 Super Luminova respectively. So I'm going to charge up my Seiko 5, and I'll also charge up the Ironwatch again. And we can see how it performs next to a Seiko 5, because I'm sure if you're not familiar with Rolex Chromalight, if you don't own a Rolex piece, you'll definitely be familiar with the performance of Seiko Lume Brights, because the same Seiko Lume Bright is used on every piece from the Seiko 5 up to their Prospex pieces like the Sumo, the Turtle and other models. So I'm sure you'll be familiar with Lume Bright. Right, so the Lume Bright's now fully charged. I'm just going to fully charge up the Ironwatch. Right, so they're both now fully charged. Let's look at them side by side. So as you can see, Seiko Lume Bright on the left, it has a green tone, which is like C3 Super Luminova, which I really like. I think the green tone of it is very aesthetically pleasing. Outstanding performance from the Seiko 5 Lume Bright. It's glowing incredibly brightly, and it will continue to glow for a good length of time. It's very good performance lume. And on the right, we have my BGW9 Super Luminova on the Ironwatch RX8004. Now, of the two, I would say that they are equal in performance in terms of brightness. One could argue that the legibility of the BGW9, which is blue tone, is better than the green tone of the Lume Bright. Now, which is better looking? It's subjective. I like the green tone of C3 Super Luminova, and I also like the green tone of Lume Bright. I think it's very nice to look at. But I have to say that the legibility, in terms of brightness, I think the BGW9 has the edge over Lume Bright. I think it's brighter. I also think the mil-sub style sword hands on the Ironwatch give better performance. The legibility of the hour hand and the minute hand is superior to the hands used on the Seiko 5, the SRPE 63K1. Now, with the Seiko 5KX, or the Dress KX as it's often referred to, they scale down the proportions on the Dress KX. They're slightly smaller than on the SKX007 and also the 5KX. The hands are slightly smaller, and therefore they don't allow for the same lume plots, the same area of Lume Bright to be applied as on the SKX007 and the 5KX. The Dress KX has a slightly smaller handset, but the applied indices still have several layers of Lume Bright, and that therefore allows for 5 to 6 layers of Lume Bright to be applied. So as you can see, both continuing to glow for a good length of time, both glowing very brightly. I still think the BGW9 has the edge over the Lume Bright in terms of brightness, but the Lume Bright is outstanding. It really is top quality lume, and it's something I really like about my Seiko 5. It's the quality of the lume is just exceptional for the price point. So I just thought I would show you the comparison between the Ironwatch versus my Submariner, and also the Ironwatch versus my Seiko 5, just so you can see the performance, because as I've discussed, I'm sure you'll be aware of the performance of Lume Bright if you're not familiar with chromalights used by Rolex. Now, of the three pieces, it may surprise you which is my favourite. It's not my Submariner, which is the king piece in my collection, and it's not my Seiko 5, which I absolutely love on the Hirsch Honey camel grain strap. This WR4K RX8004, which I consider to be a champagne watch for lemonade money, this is my personal favourite. And I just love the vintage aesthetic of it. I love the taper of the 39mm case, the large chamfers machined on the edge of the case, which reminds me of a Tudor Black Bay or a vintage Rolex piece such as the 16610 Submariner. That large bevel machined on the edge, which marks the transition between the brushed satin finished tops of the lugs and the mirror polished flanks. It's just a beautiful looking piece, and the feel good factor really is fantastic. I've been wearing this all day, and I can tell you it's just a very comfortable piece, and the feel good factor just gives 100% satisfaction. It's one of the most satisfying pieces I've ever owned. Now lastly, I'll just give you a wrist shot of my Seiko 5. I fitted this Hirsch camel grain honey strap, as you can see, and it's extra long, so it fits my 8-inch wrist. Often it's the case that straps are a fraction too short for my 8-inch wrist, so I asked Hirsch to send me some XL straps, and they sent me this camel grain one, which is honey, and the honey colour absolutely complements the blue sunburst style of the SRP 63K one, or the Dress KX, and I just love the contrast. I love the contrast of the honey tone with the blue sunburst style, and I've previously reviewed the 5KX, the SRP 63K one, which had a mirror polished bezel, and as I discussed in the review of this piece, the Dress KX, I prefer the brushed satin finish of the bezel on this piece versus the mirror polished bezel on the SRP 63, which is the bracelet version. It gives it a more tool watch aesthetic. I think the brushed satin finishing to the bezel is better done, although it still has that chamfer with the mirror polished edge to it, so it does have the complement to the mirror polished flanks. Now this is an incredibly lightweight piece on the leather strap, very comfortable, feel good factor is outstanding, and it's got the practicality of a day-date complication. One of the favourite watches I've ever owned, and I refer to this in my previous state of the collection. One doesn't have to spend €12,500 to purchase a Rolex Submariner to get satisfaction. One can get the same feel good factor and satisfaction from a low tier piece such as this Seiko 5, which is significantly less expensive. I can honestly say I enjoy wearing this Seiko 5 as much as wearing my Submariner. I rotate the pieces on a daily basis, and I really enjoy wearing this. I think it's very comfortable, the feel good factor is very good, and I love the look of it. It's just a very nice looking piece. So 3 very satisfying pieces, and I like them all, but my favourite of the 3 pieces is the WR4K RX8004, and that may come as a surprise to you, because I'm sure you would have expected me to say, well, my Submariner, being the king piece in my collection, would be my personal favourite. It's a high tier piece versus the Ironwatch, which is a mid tier piece, but really that's not the case. I actually enjoy the feeling and the look of the WR4K Ironwatch more than my Submariner, and I think I'll just show you them side by side lastly, so you can compare the proportions. The truth is, I would actually like Rolex to make a Submariner with this kind of taper on the lugs. Yes, the 124060 has a nice taper, which is better done than its predecessor, the 114060, but it doesn't go far enough. If you look at the taper on this WR4K Ironwatch, you can see it has more of a taper with the 20mm bracelet versus the 21mm lug width of my Submariner. I think the large chamfer machined on the edge of the lugs is better looking, because on the Submariner it doesn't have that large chamfer. On earlier versions, the 16610 for example, they had a nice chamfer machined on the edge of the case, and that marked the transition between the top of the lugs and the flanks. But on the Submariner Super case, on the 114060 and on this 124060, you see it doesn't have that large chamfer, it doesn't have the large bevel machined on the top edge of the case. It's just a sharp edge. And I would argue that if you look at this iron watch, it's got a nice chamfer on it, it's got a nice bevel, and that's just absolutely gorgeous the way it catches the light. It gradually increases from the crown guards, the chamfer enlarges, it becomes wider down to the tip of the lugs, and it's just a beautiful transition between the top edge of the case and the flanks. And I think it's more aesthetically pleasing. I think there's room for improvement on the Submariner, and I think the iron watch is just very good looking. So the truth is, I prefer the proportions of the WR4K Ironwatch RX8004. I think they're better proportions than on my Submariner, although I do love the watch. Looking at the cases side by side, the 39mm with a 40mm bezel with a slight overhang actually looks like a better proportion piece. So both very good looking pieces. The feel good factor of both is outstanding, but this one has the edge for me. I actually prefer the WR4K, mainly due to the fact I have a special appreciation for the 5517 mil sub. It's a piece that I'm very interested in, and I like the mil sub sword hands. I previously modified a Pagani design PD1694, as you'll know, with mil sub sword hands. I just think the mil sub sword hands are perfection personified, and they are better looking than the Mercedes hands, which are made from white gold that Rolex use on the Submariner. I think that the Submariner would look better with a set of mil sub sword hands, as per the 5517. So that's all I have to say with regards to my February 2022 State of the Collection. I really enjoyed the three pieces. Hope you've enjoyed my discussion of the State of the Collection. Please feel free to post your own comments below the video. Thank you very much.